Yeah, and unfortunately too, like people are finally coming to that like resolution where they're taking a hard look and saying, okay, because I've heard the real liberalism hasn't been tried before, and I just laughed. I'm like, okay, you're sounding like a communist trying to say real communists haven't been tried. But
Exactly.
and in a sense, though, like there's some of them that are still trying to find a way to hold on. They're like evolving and say, okay, I'm a post-liberal now. So they're basically arguing it's not that liberalism failed, it's that liberalism succeeded, and this is the result. Like we're looking at it basically. So where do we go from here? And that's why. Yeah, go ahead.
It's so that's the $1 million question, right? Because most of the conversations I have, most of them agree with you. They say, yeah, this is, classical liberalism is a fairy tale. But then as Christians, they're very hesitant to make that next step and say something like, now I'm a Christian nationalist. I understand it's not the end all be all, and I'm happy to debate with people who have better ideas or think that Christian nationalism is problematic, whatever. But that's what I get frustrated with is people are like, okay, classic liberalism is dead, but I don't know what to do. It's okay, well, we need to figure out something and we need to implement something, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, liberalism is stupid. Well, okay, then what?
Exactly. It's kind of like anyone could point out, I call it descriptive, prescriptive method. Anyone could point out the descriptive or what is the ailment. No one could point out what is the solution, or they're brave enough to do so in modern society. Like, the only places you see it are like groups like us, where you have people like you saying like, hey, we need to do Christian nationalism. Or you have groups like, shout out to the American Royalists, I interviewed them recently, where they talk about like, hey, we need integralism instead. And it's just like these different groups saying, here's where we go forward. Or even Two on Head's husband, Eudaimonia, is his account online. He's a really cool guy. He's arguing right now in favor of like post-liberalism. So it's interesting because to me, who really likes political theory, it's almost like a Game of Thrones-esque game where we're basically coming to the realization like, hey, the boomer generation is finally dying off. Where do we go from here? Because they've been holding onto the reins for a long time in this nation, where instead of them passing it on to the next generation, he's kept holding on to it. So now we're going to have a giant power vacuum saying, what are we going to do? So it's definitely an interesting time in politics to look at, especially political theory.
And as young people get more involved in leadership, which inevitably leads to political roles, these questions about how, as Christians, how do we take our Christianity into the public sphere are going to have to be answered better than that boomer generation you were referring to earlier, right? Who I think had very poor answers for, it's like, oh, we keep our Christianity at home, we keep our Bible at our dresser, and we don't take that outside of our home, we don't take it, certainly don't take it into the public sphere. We realize now what those decisions led to, which is what we have now. So then the question is, how do we as Christians engage with now? And there are still plenty of people who think that the problem was that we got involved at all, that the idea that we should have that Christians should be involved in government at all, which just blows my mind. But and if you want to talk about that, we can. But I'm
heard
very
people,
interested
funny enough, try to argue that Christian anarchism is the only solution. And I just look at them weird.
Anarchism,
like, nah,
or even the pietist that's like, look, like Christians should not vote. They should run for public office. They should join the military. They're almost like have an Amish sort of attitude towards political endeavors, right? That's a whole swath of people. But yeah, I'm very much interested in like Christian nationalism and like how do we get Christians engaged with government? Like how should we think of Christ and our government?
No, exactly. So going back on track, some of our questions I have prepared for you. I was curious, in your view, what role would you believe Christianity play in said governments or cultural for identifying of a nation? So are you trying to say here for the audience that, hey, once we do have Christian nationalism, everyone's got to be Christian? Or are you trying to say like Christians would simply, by our laws, ethics, and virtues, we'd be able to rule better than a secular government?
So I agree with that latter part, but yeah, I would say that not everybody has to be Christian, and the church has been very clear on this question, historically speaking. We don't compel people to make a profession of faith by force. That is clearly unbiblical, and the church has been very clear that that's not okay. What I would say is there is a historical Christian, to make sure that our leaders are themselves Christians, right? Like, you cannot run for public office unless you are a Christian, right? And actually in American history, that was, you had to be, and even in particular states. So like Pennsylvania, for instance, was founded as a Quaker, so they were much more open. But in places like Massachusetts, were run by Congregationalists. Rhode Island, you had to be a Baptist in order to hold public office. Like, there were different states that had different laws about you. Like, you could be an atheist, you could be a Muslim, or even if you were a Christian, right? But if you were a Catholic, you wouldn't be able to hold public office in these states. Now, we could argue about, and I do agree that that's one problem with Christian nationalism is like, okay, and you had kind of asked me this earlier, like, is this more like Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever? That is a bridge we're going to have to cross one day. There's not an easy answer for that. But yeah, I would say that that's one thing that we could be looking forward to as Christians, is be like, look, Christians have the best system of morality. Christians, like, all of the, and we can look at this historically, like all the different things that we enjoy in our society that come from Christianity. Christians gave the world all of these different institutions. It makes perfect sense to have Christians in charge of the government and to prohibit people who do not confess Christ as Lord, and to exclude them from being able to serve in public office.
Yeah, the reason too, that's a very important question, is because it really boils down to like, what is a Christian? Because especially in American history, we had a handful of founding fathers that were Unitarians. We had a handful of historical movements too, where like it was legal battles for Mormons saying like, hey, we're Christians, when obviously like majority of people who aren't Mormon believe like they're not Christians. Same for groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, what are we going to do for them? Are they going to fall in line with us? And even taking it to the extreme, like I've heard some, really into theology, like Eastern Orthodox or like some Roman Catholics, would go as far as to say like some sects of Protestantism aren't even Christian, like low church of Protestantism. And American history too, I'm thinking about like the Nativist Party in the mid 19th century. They were a very anti-Catholic movement in response to the Irish and German immigrations coming to America, where they're like, oh, Catholics aren't Christian. So that's definitely going to be something that we're going to have to think about in the future. Would you propose any idea like that, or any thoughts to like what is a Christian?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a lot of ecumenical conversations that have happened about what is a Christian. We have historical Christian creeds that people can and should subscribe to. And we would have to formulate like that. But I do think like historically confessional Christian denominations, right? Like I do think it's a problem, like people who use Christianity very flippantly, mega church type celebrity style,
like
Hillsong type church. Yeah. Like, I think it would be fine to exclude people like that and say, no, that's not at all what we mean. Because I think this is really, really important. I think having government officials who are themselves subject to the church is really, really, really important. St. Ambrose, this very famous example. So the mayor at one point got really angry about the neighboring town and sent soldiers and had them decimate. He changed his mind, but he didn't get to the soldiers in time, and the soldiers like pillaged this neighboring town, whatever. So he repented, right? He said, I'm sorry, I should have done that. And he went that following Sabbath to get communion. And St. Ambrose withheld communion. He withheld the Eucharist from him and forced him over the course of a year to go through this cycle of penance. And the mayor submitted to that. That, to me, is a perfect example of the relationship between church and government. The government's job is to vanquish evil, right? Apostle Paul makes that very clear in Romans chapter 13. It's their job to punish evil, to reward the good, right? And it's the church's job to handle ecclesiastical matters, right? The bishop doesn't tell the mayor